Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Michael P. Spradlin back with The Youngest Templar, Keeper of the Grail, Chapter 14. I hope everybody's enjoying this. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all choosing to be kind and to look out for one another. And as we move into summer, let's all hope that this virus recedes and that we can begin to get our lives back to normal a little bit. So, without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 14 of The Youngest Templar, Keeper of the Grail. The City of Acre, Udrimmer, June 1191. Chapter 14. We spent the night camped right on the battlefield. I was exhausted, but the aftermath of our victory meant only more work. Everyone, even the knights, pitched in to carry casualties from the field. The physicians worked like demons long into the night, treating the injured. Burial details were formed, and prayers were said over the simple graves of our fallen comrades. The battle had been won, but I couldn't help but feel the cost had been too great. We had lost nearly 100 men, and almost double that had been wounded in some manner. When I finally had a moment to catch my breath, I dropped to the ground near a cook fire, but found I had no appetite. A pot of stew simmered on the coals, but the very thought of food made me ill. I sat, staring off at nothing. Sensing movement, I looked up to see Sir Thomas standing beside me. I should have stood, but I was too tired. "I've just come from a conference with the king," he said. "Yes, sire?" Uh-oh. "He tells me a certain squire rode to his rescue at a critical point in the fight this afternoon." From his tone, I couldn't tell if he was angry or proud. "He did?" "Yes. Apparently the squire gave up his horse so the king could return to safety." I shrugged, staring at the fire. "Tristan, what you did was incredibly brave, and also dangerous. I believe I left you with orders to stay at your post unless I required your assistance during the fighting." I looked up at Sir Thomas and saw the concerned smile on his face. He wasn't mad. Exactly. "Forgive me, sire. I don't know what came over me. When I saw the king there with the Saracens about to overtake him, I just reacted," I stammered. "I understand, and you've become quite the hero to the entire army. You saved a comrade without thinking of yourself, and the king, no less. That is one of the marks of greatness in a warrior, Tristan. But please, no more such acts of bravery. England can always get a new king. Good squires are not easy for me to find," he said. I looked at Sir Thomas and he winked at me. "Get some rest," he said. "We ride out in the morning." It felt good to receive his praise, but in truth, Sir Thomas' words did little to resolve the conflicting emotions that poured through me. I struggled to understand what I had seen that day, and more important, why any of it had happened in the first place. Finally, exhaustion overcame me, and I slept right there by the fire. The next afternoon, our forces rode onto the plains surrounding the city of Acre and received a large force of crusaders that had besieged it some months earlier. It was a beautiful spot, sitting right on the seacoast. From our position, I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, and the sound was almost comforting somehow. The city itself sat on a promontory that jutted out into the sea. Out in the harbor, several crusader ships bobbed in the waves as they blockaded the port. Beyond the stone walls, I could see the tiled rooftops of the buildings inside, and as we moved into position, the Saracens began to yell and jeer at us from the battlements, but they soon lost interest and fell silent. "It's a pretty spot," I said to Quincy as we surveyed the countryside. "Yes, it is. Sir Basil was here years ago. He says it was quite a wild place then. There are caves below the city, and I guess many pirates and marauders use them as a base. Perhaps we'll have a chance to explore them someday," he said. I would rather have left the caves to the pirates. I much preferred the open air, and who knew? There could still be pirates hiding in them. I'd never met any, but I was fairly certain I wasn't going to like pirates, just on principle. The garrison of Saracens inside Acre had been holding out for months, desperate for Saladin to send reinforcements, which he had yet to do. Upon his arrival, King Richard met with the Saracen leaders under a flag of truce and immediately demanded they cede the city to his command. They refused. For 6 weeks, we camped outside the city, fighting sporadically, but mainly waiting for them to just give up. Exhausted and running low on food, they were overwhelmed with sick and wounded and could barely mount a defense. The king preferred to wait them out, not wanting to needlessly sacrifice men in an assault when it seemed like they would capitulate before long. The surrender finally came on the 11th of July, and Acre was ours. We marched inside the gates, and I watched the Saracens, now prisoners of war, being led away. The Christian citizens of Acre were overjoyed to have the city under the Crusaders' control once again. They had been well traded during Saladin's occupation. He had issued proclamations allowing them to worship as they pleased and to keep their homes and businesses. But when the siege began, not only was the city surrounded, the Crusaders had closed off the port as well, and no supplies at all could get in or out. With no medicines and very little food, the people had grown sick and hungry. The king immediately sent word to Cyprus and points east, and in a few days' time ships began arriving with food and medicines. The Templar physicians enlisted the aid of us squires to help them treat the sick, and we shared our food with some who were near starvation. In these days, the true character of men like Sir Thomas, Sir Basil, and Quincy and the other Templars was revealed to me. They were not just there to fight for fighting's sake. Their purpose was the liberation of their fellow Christians. The first days of our reoccupation, when I wasn't attending to my duties, I took what time I could to explore the city. As in Dover, a marketplace took up the center of the city with stone-paved streets leading in and out of all four directions. Every building was constructed of stone, with brightly colored awnings covering the doorways and windows. It was a marked contrast to all of Dover's buildings, as all of Dover's buildings were built of timber, and though it had been a noisily, lively place, Acre felt more subdued and quieter. Perhaps the long siege had taken some of the spirit out of the people. Being inside Acre confirmed what I'd felt as we had ridden out from the beach upon the first landing here, that I was in an alien place. Everything from the spicy smells of the cooking fires to the elegant archways of the buildings and temples was new and unusual. It was going to take some getting used to. Sir Thomas and I moved our belongings into rooms in the Knight's Hall. Unlike Dover, where the squires had slept in separate quarters, knights and squires shared rooms. Our days quickly assumed a routine similar to life at the Dover Commandery. We attended to our horses and equipment and worked on preparing the city's defenses. Though we had broken and beaten a Saracen force on our way into the city, no one expected Saladin to give up easy. This fight won't sit well with Saladin. This defeat won't sit well with Saladin, Sir Thomas said as he walked along a parapet above the east wall. He'll be back soon and will likely be on the other end of a siege. Sir Thomas was possessed of an uncommon energy in those days. He was everywhere at once. I was amazed at the depth and array of his knowledge of battle tactics. I learned much just by watching him. No detail was too small. He would climb high in the towers and along the battlements that lined the city walls looking for weaknesses. He constantly checked the sight lines of the archers and made sure that each siege of ballistae, the large mechanical crossbows that threw giant arrows at the enemy, was placed in the most strategic position. He was fanatical about making sure our positions were well defended as possible. Each day, thoughts of what I had seen on the battlefield paraded through my mind, and I wondered how Sir Thomas was able to dedicate himself to a life like this. How could a man accept such horror and carnage and not be affected by what he saw? One morning, as we finished our inspection of the northern battlements, I couldn't keep my questions to myself any longer. "Sire, forgive me, but I am troubled by something," I said. "I could tell. You haven't been yourself the past few days. Tell me what it is," he said. "It is the battle, sire. What I saw, what we did." I couldn't find the words. "You have a good heart, Tristan. I could tell it bothered you. It should. It was horrible," he said. "So why do we fight then, if such a terrible thing?" I asked. "That is a good question, Tristan. A warrior, a true warrior, must always ask if his cause is just. The taking of another's life is not a trifle. You fight because you must. There can be no other option." "But sire, why do we fight here?" I asked. "What is wrong with talking and sorting out our differences?" "The fighting usually starts when the talking ends. It lasts until men grow weary of fighting and seek to talk again. Then the fighting stops, for a while. But in the end, there is always more fighting. It is what men do. It has always been this way. So if we fight, we must choose why we fight. Then we fight with honor. It is the only way. It will take time, and I'm afraid you may see many more horrible things before you do. But you will understand eventually," he said. I was still confused, but as I worked things out in my mind, I kept seeing certain images over and over. It was the sight of Sir Thomas after the battle giving water to a fallen enemy. I thought of Sir Basil carrying a wounded man from the field. I remembered the Templar physicians treating both sick Christian and Muslim children in the city. If I was going to fight, I would fight nobly and with honor, like Sir Thomas and his comrades. For weeks we worked long, hard hours, rising before the sun came up and falling dead tired into our beds at night. One morning there was word that King Richard and his guards would be leaving the next day. He would ride east to inspect his forces in Tyre, another coastal city. The king desperately wanted to take the Crusaders who were waiting in Tyre and press toward Jerusalem in the south, not be cooped up in Acre if Saladin's armies returned to the city. I was working in the stable when word came that Sir Thomas was to see me. I found him in the main room of the Knight's Hall, seated at one of the long tables with Sir Basil. "Ah, Tristan, there you are," he said. "Yes, sire, you wished to see me?" "Yes, I did." "You have no doubt that King Richard will be departing shortly," he asked. "Yes, sire," I said. Reaching into his tunic, he removed a letter and handed it to me. It was thick and felt as if it had something inside it other than just sheets of parchment. It was sealed with Sir Thomas's mark in wax. "I need you to take this letter to one of the king's guard. He will be somewhere in the Crusaders' palace. His name is Gaston. A rather burly fellow, brown hair. Give the letter to him and only him. It is for the master of the order in London, and Gaston will see that he gets to him safely. Do you understand?" "Yes, sire. Gaston of the King's Guards," I repeated. "Excellent. Now off with you." I left the Knight's Hall and in a few minutes reached the Crusader's Palace. Asking around, I was told that Gaston might be found in the stables below the palace. Finding my way there, I walked toward a large open doorway that led inside. The stables were quiet and nearly deserted, save for a solitary guard who sat on a barrel in front of one of the stalls, sharpening a small dagger with a stone. At my approach, he stood, sheathing the dagger, and rested his forearm on the hilt of his sword. His casual stance jogged something in my memory. It was possible I had seen him here in Acre, passing by the barracks, or perhaps on duty outside the king's quarters, but he seemed more familiar than that. As I drew closer, it came to me. I had seen him before, not here in Acre, but before that, in the streets of Dover. On the day I had been followed as I led Dauntless to Little John's smithy, this man and the guard who entered the tavern, and I was willing to wager, sent the two drunks after me. What's more, I saw his face that he recognized me as well, though he tried not to show it. "Do I know you?" I asked. The guard shook his head. "No, I don't think so. State your business." "I'm looking for someone. I was told he'd be here," I said. He shrugged and stared off over my shoulder. "Have you ever been to Dover?" I asked. "No," he said, but he fidgeted nervously. "You followed me a few months ago. You stood outside the Whistling Pig Tavern and watched while two drunks tried to beat me and steal my knight's horse," I said. The man looked down at the ground, then up at the ceiling. Anywhere but at my face. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't been posted in Dover in years. You shouldn't be making such rash accusations, boy," he said, finally looking at me. His tone had changed, full of menace now. "I would learn to keep my mouth shut if I were you, squire. Now run along." "I want to know why you—" But I couldn't get the words out because before I knew it, he had pushed me roughly to the ground. I sprawled in the dirt, stunned, and watched his hand move back to the hilt of his sword. "I have no time for this, boy. Leave before I teach you a lesson in manners you'll not soon forget." He glared down at me. I stood up, never taking my eyes off him. "You'll answer for this," I said. "Sir Thomas and the Templars will—" He moved to pull his sword, but not quickly, believing he could easily frighten me. I was faster. I grabbed his arm and held onto it with all my strength. I pushed him back against the door to the stall, pinning him in place. "You fool," he said as he struggled. "Attacking a king's guard? You'll be hanged." "Perhaps, but not before you give me some answers. Why did you follow me that day? Why did you send those men after me?" The man said nothing, only attempted to free his arm from my grip. Just as he was about to break loose, someone spoke from behind us. "What is the meaning of this?" Before I could turn, I saw the guard's eyes widen in fear. Though I had heard it up close only a few times, I recognized the voice. I released my grip on the guard and spun around. The Lionheart stood before me. He had a small squad of guards with him, two of whom had drawn their swords and now pointed them at me. He was dressed to ride, wearing his red tunic with the golden lions emblazoned on his chest, leather riding pants and knee-high boots. A large sword hung at his belt, and he held a helmet under his arm. I was in trouble if I did not act carefully. "Your Highness," I said, bowing. King Richard stared at me, and a slow look of recognition came over his face. "You are that boy, Thomas Lihue, squire?" he asked. "Yes, your Majesty," I said. "You came to my aid on the battlefield," he said. It was not a question, more a statement of fact. I shrugged. "Why are you assaulting one of my guards?" he asked. "I'm afraid it was a misunderstanding. I was looking for someone. Sir Thomas sent me with a message for one of your men. This man and I got into an argument." The king waved his hand, and two guards sheathed their weapons. "I take offense at those who would attack my men," he said. "I could have you hanged." Something told me to be bold. For some reason, being in my presence made the king uneasy. Still, he was the monarch. He could end my life with a word. But I felt he would respect me more if I showed no fear. "You could, sire," I said. "My apologies." I bellowed again slightly, but held his gaze. His eyes bored into me again, much as they had that night in the castle of Dover. I tried not to act nervous or afraid, but I was in over my head, and this stare began to make me uncomfortable. It was almost like he was trying to decide, should I kill this boy or knight him? "I owe a great debt to Sir Thomas, and since you intervened on my behalf in battle, I will overlook this offense. Do not let it happen again. Never threaten one of my men. Understood?" "Yes, your Majesty," I said, bowing again. "Who is it you seek?" he asked. I told him that I had a message for a guard named Gaston. King Richard barked a command, and one of the guards stepped forward. The king brushed past me into the stables, and the rest of his squad followed as they readied their mounts to depart. I stared after the man I just tussled with, but he ignored me as he went to the stall where his horse was quartered and began adjusting the saddle. Gaston stood before me, a dour-looking fellow, but he matched the description Sir Thomas had given me. "Sir Thomas asked me to give this to you," I said, handing him the letter. "It is for the Master of the Order. Can you see it safely to London?" "Of course. I know Sir Thomas well. After I ride with the king to Tyre, I'll be posted back to England. I'll make sure the letter reaches the master, Gaston replied. I thought it best to get away from the king as soon as possible, so I quickly left the palace grounds. I walked across the city square, climbing up the parapets over the main gate. A few minutes later, the king and his guards departed the city to the east. I watched as the Lionheart rode out, surrounded by his men, back astride his pure white warhorse. I kept my eyes on them until they disappeared from sight on the eastern horizon. My duty done, I left the parapet, intending to return to the Knight's Hall, where I still had unfinished work. As I made my way through the busy streets, I could suddenly hear from far off in the distance the sound of Saracen trumpets. Saladin was coming. And that's the end of chapter 14. We'll be back tomorrow with chapter 15. Everybody take it easy.